Often I've said to myself and to others that it's hard to have a unique take. Maybe this won't sound genuine considering half of the subject matter for this video, and the people who know me probably think of me as someone who tends towards negativity before positivity.
As if!
But the main reason I started this channel was to gush about stuff I love. The problem with this is that a good enough work attracts a sycophantic audience, be it a cult hit or a mainstream smash, and what can be said about it has been said plenty before I can even step up to bat. I could talk at length about, say, the end of Evangelion as one of the best and most dense movies ever released, but what meaning could I even stake a claim to without finding myself redundant on this platform and others? But over the last month or so, following the leaking and release of a certain hotly anticipated zombie but not really about zombies, shooter but not really about shooting, I've realized I was wrong on two fronts. For one, it's very easy to have unique takes whether you don't care about them being good or not. And also, no matter how unlikely, there's always the chance that dumb luck prevails to find meat still clinging to the bones of a hallowed corpse long since picked clean by the vultures of critical analysis. Alright, it's a bad take, but there's a good comparison to be made, one which has explicitly been stated by the de facto auteur Neil Druckmann himself.
Metal Gear Solid 2 is one of my favorite games, and there's no question that was an inspiration in this.
They're two experimental sequels which contrast their predecessors down to two notably famous two-word summaries, both usually called pretentious by their detractors due to a heavy story emphasis, but the obvious comparison which towers above all is an eerily similar controversy. Critical acclaim versus fan dispute in the wake of the same bold story choice to throw out a lovable old lead in favour of inherently unlikable new blood, even down to the same techniques to hide this early twist. Editing footage to use for trailers and promotional media, portraying things that aren't there, and completely hiding their new protagonists, drawing ire from some who would accuse the companies of false advertising. It's not a decision done flippantly, and truth be told, not one done out of friendliness. A hostile studio decision which finds itself in a degree of hatred for the audience they're betraying, well documented in Kojima's case at least. And yet here we are where one is beloved while the other is scorned. Are we just too early on in the timeline to appreciate the latter, just as the former was the black sheep among the capital G gamer crowds of its era? Well, while there's a lot more to each game than their early twists, they end up functioning as the core of the story regardless, the moments that shape what the rest of the game will entail, and there's three key points of difference to them which highlights the difference between the overall products. Metal Gear Solid is pretty plainly a game that looks up to artsy cinema from the word go, and down to its design, it's a pretty earnest attempt to appeal to the old chestnut of anti-war and anti-violence. While earlier in the year video game players would be blowing apart zombies with light guns and beating their younger siblings with a kind of brutal unfairness that scars deeper than anything physical, not even 2 weeks after the very first Rainbow Six released on PC and showed us how much fun it is to kill insurgent terrorists, MGS1 would try to convince us of the very opposite. Solid Snake was an unwilling super soldier, cloned as a weapon of war with no regard for his personality and used only for killing. A setup which fit far better in the very anti-war movie canon than a medium still innovating through more visceral and gratifying violence. Even if you had no moral qualms with murdering the goons of Metal Gear Solid, in a title that rewards the avoidance of combat through stealth, you'd be a fool to take the Rambo approach and seek out violence that only gets you killed. But as we all know, Solid Snake didn't come to be revered as a symbol of peace. His effective retirement at the end of the game, both written off as dead and marked for death by the virus coursing through his system, didn't slow the fan demand for more high-tension outings with the legendary mercenary. A large swath of fans had put Snake on a pedestal and worshipped his military accomplishments, just like the in-game characters had before learning of his somewhat pitiful, isolated, and antisocial lifestyle.
Oh, just what I'd expect from the legendary Solid Snake.
And in clamoring to see more action, had come to stand for what the villains of Kojima's story had intended.
You enjoy all the killing.
His audience misread his original and only wanted to buy a rerun, so long as it had the same surface-level qualities they were looking for. So, The Last of Us is also obviously inspired by cinema, maybe even one specific film, and focuses largely on contrasting the proxy father-daughter relationship of Joel and Ellie with the harsh reality of living in a zombie apocalypse. Joel is a character who's perfectly described by the word selfish, not in the negative sense of being a hoarder or being deliberately cruel, but as someone who acts as a survivalist and as someone who doesn't care about utilitarian ideals if it puts the people he cares about in danger. Nothing better displays this set of values than his final controversial decision to kill the Fireflies and rob them of the chance of developing a vaccine. even if there are a million other things to justify it, like effectiveness, distribution, or consent. In fact, it says a lot that the more hotly contested action of Joel's is to lie to Ellie about what he did.
I swear.
The people who love Joel, of which there are many, don't love him based on a misread of his character, but because they sympathize with how he was presented by the first game, as a man who puts himself and his pseudo-family before others. If there's any lack of support for the self-sacrifice needed to side with the Fireflies, the fault lies in the game for not presenting a better case, something which a sequel would seek to correct in the strongest and most hostile of terms. For all the Snake worshippers, hungry for this paragon of badassery who gets the job done, what better remedy is there than to play as the complete opposite? Clean-shaven, skinny, and fair-haired, Raiden is as far from the professional cool as it gets as a VR-trained rookie who's outfoxed at every corner. When MGS2's longer encounters and fights aren't just timed holdouts, your victories are never victories for his character. When you defuse a series of sensor-activated bombs on a bridge you need to cross, you're immediately sent into a boss fight against a
Shit!
and when you defeat that, the bridge is blown to pieces, forcing you across strict and fragile platforms with instant death waiting below. You'll beat a boss to start a slow escort mission for 20 minutes, only to have her killed by the very boss thought to be dead at the end of it anyway. But even through all of this, the people who wanted more of the first game have found their monkey's paw wish granted. From a cast of eerily similar characters, similar rooms, and borderline identical plot progression, up until the grand reveal that the entire mission was a recreation of the events of the first game to condition someone into becoming a second Solid Snake, a jab in itself at his idolizers. At the tail end of the game, however, Raiden gets to deviate from the pattern when he gets something entirely different from the first game. A katana, complete with its own mechanics and playstyle. As you learn more about his backstory, he steps out of the shadow cast by Snake from both the plot and the fanbase, and finishes the game by rejecting him and the player. By seeking his own individuality and meaning in life, he stops being a ball and chain for the Snake fanatic and becomes an example for them when he stops mimicking the legend of Solid Snake, a work not seeking to solely punish, but show the audience how to change for the better. Joel fans, on the other end, are left blindsided and confused by the conclusion to his arc. The misrepresentation of Joel centers on a love for his paternal aspects and a supposed ignorance to the cutthroat actions and selfishness it's founded on. While I'd argue that's not really the case, as you're constantly reminded of it throughout the first game, it's a moot point in the sequel where Joel is killed as a direct result of him acting in exactly the opposite manner, supposedly mellowing out after 5 off-screen years of complete peace in a scavenger and zombie-infested wasteland. When saving the life of a group of strangers, he's killed in an act of revenge far more selfish than anything he's done in its brutality and pointlessness, and the player spends half of the game playing as his killer, in an attempt to make you see him from an outsider's perspective. Buried deep in a wastebasket somewhere, lost in the planning phases, I'm sure, is a concept with great potential. What is it like to be on the other side of Joel's territorial ideology if, say, you have something he needs? After the first game constantly showing him to always be right in his mistrust of others, what happens when he gets it wrong on calling someone's bluff?
What about the guy?
He ain't even hurt.
When it's for his group's well-being, are we supposed to still love him when he treats a similar group of fairly moral survivors like the scavengers he slaughtered en masse? But The Last of Us 2 is uninterested in presenting Joel with moral ambiguity. From Abby's perspective, Joel is the one who killed her father, now a surgeon of high ideals who is willing to stain his hands with the blood of a child to create the miracle vaccine. His de facto disciple Ellie is a psychopath with all of his combat talents, but hungry for revenge and seeking to be deliberately cruel instead of callous and single-minded as Joel was. Even in flashbacks on Ellie's side, Joel's choice is constantly asserted to have been a mistake. Fireflies are viewed with rose-tinted glasses, and Joel can't muster a single argument to defend himself. At the end, when it looks like Ellie has forgiven him as she suddenly forgives Abby, she leaves the last memento she owns of him behind as she travels on. While not avenging him can be seen as a virtuous decision, it's hard to say the same for what looks like Ellie resolving to abandon him entirely. The fans at fault, those who dismiss the darker side of Joel, don't get an olive branch extended to them. They're simply strapped in for a ride of suffering as they watch him die and his loved ones tear themselves apart while spiting his decision with nary a hint of sympathy. The audience isn't given any persuasion to see Joel in a harsher light. They're punished for having a soft spot for him in the first place. Metal Gear Solid 2 is a game about a lot of things, but it all centers on the idea of mimetic theory. For the ambitious men and women in the world who aim to leave a mark on the planet larger and longer lasting than themselves, most had no need to look further than the time-honored tradition of baby making to leave a genetic legacy. The anti-villain of MGS2, sterilized as a clone from birth, doesn't have that option, and instead wants to leave behind a set of ideals powerful enough to be carried on to future generations, a mimetic legacy.
What is our legacy if we cannot pass the torch?
But even in the seemingly powerful position of the US presidency, his decisions are guided and his message is constricted by the invisible hand of the Patriots, who maintain power by controlling the flow of information and censoring information deemed worthless.
All this junk data preserved in an unfiltered state, growing at an alarming rate.
What better way to prove their point than by doing some misdirection of their own, selling you on the wrong protagonist through quote-unquote false advertising? Raiden worships the mimetic legend of Solid Snake based on the in-universe, overly simplified retelling of the events of the first game, and eventually starts to lose his grip on what is real as virtual reality begins to blur the lines. For a game about the power of information in the digital age and leaving behind messages which stand the test of time, its role in video game history has surely lived up to that standard. 20 years down the track, its quotes still ring eerily true.
The untested truths, spun by different interests, continue to churn and accumulate in the sandbox of political correctness and value systems.
MGS2 is designed from the ground up to be a video game, undeniably one which would take serious tweaking to work as, say, a movie, but even so is broken free of the stigmas of its medium, being dissected in academia from MIT to journals around the world, even being featured in the Smithsonian for a time, without ever putting on airs of superiority or condescension. Any debt accrued from the deliberate trickery in its early hours, it's fair to say has been paid off in full. But when looking at the themes of The Last of Us 2, it's entirely unclear what the point of it all is.
What is, to each of you, the message of The Last of Us Part 2?
Man, I think it's a lot of things. It's empathy. It's also, for me, but I don't know. I still am trying to summarize what the game means to me. Oh, hello, sir.
Sorry, yeah.
There's multi-layered. I remember the first time that Neil walked me down the story and he was like, this cycle of violence. Me, what became more and more clear is that obsession will cost you everything. And that they both just can't let go. If they would just be able to let it go, we can pass on the sins of the father so easily. That is the context, or that's the story that happens within the confines of the context of the game. What is it is 100% in line with this game, and the fact that it is relevant. The Last of Us holds up a mirror to that and says, are you willing to hate the thing you love? And not only will you love it, will you selflessly love it? Don't love this thing selfishly for what you want it to be, but can you love it for what it is? That is, this game, I've never played a game in my life requires so much of me, and it refuses to allow me to love this thing selfishly, and it demands that I love it selflessly. Society.
Neil, what's the message?
I'm always afraid to answer these questions. You know, when we first started talking about this game, I said, you know, the first game's about love, this game's about hate. That's not true. Both games are about love.
What you would expect to be the deeper themes of the story reveal themselves to be either laughably overdone, contradictory to the plot, or both. The glorification of video game violence has been tackled many a time before, and the humans are the real monsters angle is such a trite staple of the zombie genre that I'm eager to see a story where the zombies are actually the main driving force of evil. What the main thrust of the story appears to be, by all accounts, is that the cycle of revenge is a destructive and pointless endeavor. For one, it's something that's hard to disagree with for anybody with a functioning frontal lobe, but also something the story borders on working against, after Ellie's decision to spare the life of the undeserving Abby leaves her no different in the end as if she went through with it. Ultimately, we have one of three conclusions to draw from. First, it could be that these weak, deeper messages were intended to be the main ones, which makes sense for a self-serious work of its kind, even if it might lead me to believe in group delusion or a cocaine level of addiction to the gameplay. Alternatively, it could be that the themes of the most importance are those at a surface level, a development process which emphasizes casts of protein-guzzling female leads, pregnant action heroes, clumsy transgender subplots, and lesbians having sex while smoking weed over the subtext you might expect from a story of this much self-importance. Or finally, and most depressingly likely, the themes are wholly irrelevant to The Last of Us 2. The Abby twist doesn't fit into a larger message, only a plot that you'd assume to be a vessel for deeper meaning. Each death doesn't serve any purpose other than hammering in how brutal the post-apocalypse world is and how horribly the main factions treat each other. I can't even say that the writers had a specific kind of fan in mind to punish with its gut-punch prologue. In fact, the more the gross and off-putting events carry on, is the clearer it becomes that Naughty Dog wants everyone to suffer for no real reason at all. Really, who else other than a dedicated team of nihilists would go to painstaking lengths to make you sympathize with the ethos of the Fireflies? You see no point in trying to live in a world where the utilitarian sacrifices of others can't be made.
How long before she's torn to pieces by a pack of clickers? That is, if she hasn't been raped and murdered first.
To punish someone you don't hold power over takes confidence, and to get away with it takes attraction. Ask anybody into BDSM and I'm sure they'll vouch for me. When you start your story by spitting in the reader's face, the rest of it fights an uphill battle to make the pain worth it. Achieved in Metal Gear Solid 2 by a deep dive into concepts foreign but increasingly relevant to a fledgling video game industry, and with an ending equally confusing, unsettling, but memorable and packed with meaning. The Last of Us Part 2, devoid of anything but emotional response, instead wants to keep twisting its knife into the wound it started with until it leaves a scar that can't be ignored. Years down the line, after one shaped my beliefs and set me on a course to practicing writing and content creation, I'll find myself bringing up its ideas in conversations with friends and family, not to be forgotten by me or many others until the day brain rot starts to set in. But the short and sharp burst of meaningless pain from a stubbed toe won't last longer than a few days of offhand complaints and idle chat. And if anything fits the label of junk data, it's too much time and too many words wallowing in my misery.
Listen, don't obsess over words so much. Find the meaning behind the words, then decide.